March 1999, 6,739 meters. Here, on the summit of the Lulailako volcano, the air is so thin that the human brain begins to die. The temperature is low enough to freeze the blood in the veins. This is a dead world, a place unfit for life. And it was here that they found 3 murdered children. They weren't bones. They were whole bodies, morbidly preserved by the harsh environment. The first, known as La Doncella, a young girl of about 15, sat upright in a rocky niche. Her body was frozen stiff. Scientists later discovered that her lungs were full of air when she died, a sign that she had been buried alive and slowly suffocated while her body froze. Between her teeth and cheeks was a handful of coca leaves soaked in saliva, her last sedative. Her clothes were unwrinkled, her hair braided into hundreds of intricate braids. It was the meticulous care of those who had prepared her for death. The second body was that of a 7-year-old boy. The evidence of his terror was undeniable. His clothes were covered in frozen vomit. A rope was tied tightly around his body, trapping him in a contorted position. Forensic analysis later revealed that he had defecated in his pants out of extreme stress and fear before he died. There was a fracture in his skull, indicating that he had been struck on the head with a hard object. The last body was a 6-year-old girl. Her fate after death was even more bizarre. A lightning strike had struck her makeshift grave, sending millions of volts of electricity through her body, cooking her flesh and disfiguring her face. The heat had exploded some of the metal objects buried with her, leaving behind molten debris. She, Little Lightning, had died twice, once by human hands and once by the fury of nature. This was no ordinary massacre. The position of the bodies, the presence of valuables of gold, silver, and seashells buried with them, suggested that this was not a robbery or murder. This was a carefully orchestrated murder, an act calculated to the last detail. This was a ritual. To understand the sick logic behind this act, we must look at the machine that created it. The Inca Empire. For the Incas, or Tawantinsuyu, this was not a crime. It was a necessity, a cold cosmic equation. Their world operated on a principle called aini, reciprocity, or more bluntly, a system of debt and repayment. The gods, the mountains, Apu, the sun, Inti, the Earth Mother, Pachamama, provided humans with the things they needed to survive: water, light, land. In return, humans owed a debt. Most of the time, this debt was repaid in simple things: a few coca leaves, a little corn, beer. But when the gods are angry, when an earthquake flattens a city, when a drought dries up the fields, when a plague kills thousands, the debt becomes enormous, and an enormous debt demands a payment to match. The emperor, Sapa Inca, who was considered the son of the sun god, was charged with balancing the cosmic books. He had to make a payment that could not be refused. That payment is human life. But not just any life was valuable enough. The offering had to be perfect. A healthy, beautiful child, without a scar or blemish. A child of noble birth was even better, since the blood of the elite was considered more valuable. These children were not seen as victims in the sense we understand them. They were seen as chosen offerings, the purest offerings to the gods. The 3 bodies atop Lulailako were not lost children. They were payments. They were at the heart of a state-sponsored process, a ritual killing machine known as Capacocha. And their story is not a mystical tale. It is a forensic record of cruelty legitimized by faith and power. The order was issued from Cusco. In the heart of the empire, high priests and state officials determined that a cosmic debt needed to be paid. The size of the debt would determine the amount of offering required. The order was not a spiritual call. It was an administrative directive, a quota to be met. Missions were sent from the capital to the 4 corners of the empire, not to preach, but to collect. Their job was to assess and select the most perfect children. This was a rigorous quality control, Officials would travel to the provinces and ask local chiefs, curakas, to present the best children in their communities, often from the chief's own families. Each child would be meticulously examined. Teeth had to be straight and free of cavities. Hair had to be thick and free of disease. Skin had to be free of scars, birthmarks, and blemishes. Any defect, no matter how small, would result in the child being discarded as a defective product. They were considered no different from the best llamas selected for sacrifice. The ideal age was between 4 and 10. This was the age of purity according to the Inca, but it also had a cruelly pragmatic meaning. Old enough to walk and obey orders, but young enough to be unable to resist effectively. For the family, this was not an honor bestowed, but a forced transaction. Being chosen was an order that could not be refused. Refusing the Sapa Inca's request was tantamount to treason. The consequences would not only fall on the family, but on their entire community. It could be military punishment, the confiscation of their lands, or exclusion from the empire's trade network. Their choice was simple: comply or be destroyed. In exchange for the life of their child, the family received clear material benefits. Their clan was promoted to a higher rank in the rigid Inca caste system. They were exempted from compulsory hard labor, mitah, for life. They were granted titles, land, and valuable goods. It was an exchange of blood for power and security. The pain of losing a child was eased with social status and wealth. The Inca state also deployed a powerful propaganda machine to legitimize the act. The child was not dying. He was returning to the sun god, becoming a guardian deity, Huaca, the community's eternal ambassador to the spirit world. Death was redefined as immortality. Pain was transformed into pride. Any resistance was suppressed not only by force, but also by heavy psychological and religious pressure. The moment a child is chosen, he or she ceases to be human. Legally and spiritually, he or she is dead to this world. He or she becomes a sacred object. The child is immediately separated from the family. The parents no longer have any authority over their child. They are given to the priestesses of the sun god, Aklas, who care for and supervise them during the transition period. The journey to Cusco was the first step in this process of dehumanization. On the way, no one was allowed to look them in the face. Speaking directly to them was taboo. They were no longer children with names and personalities. They were sacred cargo en route to the center of power. They ate the best food, wore the finest clothes, but they were no different from animals fattened before slaughter. When they arrived in Cusco, they were presented to the Sapa Inca in a series of grand public ceremonies. It was the height of political theater. By gathering children from the farthest reaches of the empire, from the coastal deserts of Peru to the jungles of Ecuador, from the highlands of Bolivia to the valleys of Argentina, the Sapa Inca sent a powerful, unspoken message. All peoples and all lands are under my control. What is most precious to you is mine, and I have the right to dispose of it. These children had been stripped of their families, their names, their identities. Now, in Cusco, they would be stripped of the last thing, their will. The sacrificial machine was ready for the next phase, a phase that would last months, even years, the final preparations before execution. Once presented and legitimized in Cusco, the chosen children were not immediately sent to execution. They entered the final stages of preparation, a period that could last from several months to over a year. Cusco was not a place to glorify them. It was a laboratory, and the bodies of these children were the subjects of tightly controlled experimentation, with one goal in mind: to create the perfect offering. The incontrovertible evidence of this process lies in something the Incas would never have expected: the victim's hair. Human hair is a biological diary. It grows at a steady rate, and as it grows, it locks in the chemical traces of everything the body consumes. By analyzing fragments of La Doncella's hair, scientists have been able to piece together the story of the last year of her life. The story begins with diet. Isotope analysis showed that for most of her life, she had eaten a diet based on C3 plants, mainly potatoes. a typical diet for a farmer living in the highlands. But about a year before her death, the chemical composition of her hair changed suddenly and dramatically. Her diet shifted to C4 plants, specifically corn, and a large amount of animal protein, namely llama meat. This was not a simple improvement in living standards. It was a deliberate process of fattening up. An offering to the gods had to be healthy and well-fed. A skinny, malnourished child would be an affront, a sign of imperial stinginess. Moreover, corn and llama meat were the food of the nobility. By feeding these children the diet of the elite, the Inca state was symbolically transforming them, raising their value to be worthy of the gods. They were being raised not to live, but to die a more perfect death. But the physical manipulation didn't stop there. The diary in La Doncella's hair revealed an even darker secret. During the last 6 to 8 weeks of her life, her levels of two substances spiked: coca leaves and alcohol from the corn beer chicha. This was not a ritual use. It was a systematic drugging process. Coca leaves, when chewed, are a powerful stimulant, helping to combat fatigue, hunger, and the symptoms of altitude sickness. Chicha beer, brewed with a high alcohol content, was used to induce intoxication. By constantly feeding these two substances to their children, the Inca state achieved several goals at once. First, it was a tool of control. A child constantly, in a state of alcohol-induced stupor and coke-induced euphoria, would become docile, submissive, and less likely to rebel or escape. Their fears and despair would be dulled by the chemical effects. The Inca state controlled more than their actions. It controlled their consciousness. They were turned into puppets, ready for the final journey without the ability to fully perceive or resist. Second, it is a physiological aid. The journey from Cusco to the sacrificial peaks is an extreme physical challenge, spanning hundreds, even thousands of kilometers. Coca leaves will help these tiny bodies endure the long distances and thin air of the high mountains. They are being medically optimized to survive until they reach the place of execution. After months of preparation, the children, now likely addicted to stimulants, were sent on their final journey. Each child was the centerpiece of a small procession, including priests, officials, and attendants. They carried not only the child, but also all the items needed for the tomb: small gold and silver statues, intricately woven garments, ceramic, pots filled with food and chicha beer. It was a meticulously planned logistical operation. The journey to Lulelico took months, through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The children, even aided by Coca, could not have completed the journey on their own. They were almost certainly carried for much of the journey, especially during the final climb. They were simply living cargo, being transported to their destination. They had been fattened, drugged, and transported thousands of miles. Their bodies and minds had been fashioned to suit the purposes of the state. Now, standing at the foot of the Lulailaco volcano, the laboratory had done its work. It was time for the slaughterhouse. The final climb to the summit of Lulailaco was not a spiritual pilgrimage. It was a death march. For the drugged and weakened children, as well as for the priests themselves, every step above 6,000 meters was a battle against their own bodies. Brains screamed for oxygen. Lungs burned in the cold, dry air. Acute altitude sickness brought on severe headaches, nausea, and hallucinations. The children, almost certainly unconscious or in a stupor, were carried or dragged like sacks. They were cargo being transported to the final destination. The crime scene was not a majestic temple. Near the summit were a few crude stone structures, hastily erected to block the wind. This was the final stop, where the last rites were performed, quickly and efficiently. There was no religious ecstasy. There was only a process to be completed in an environment where every moment of delay could cost the executioners their lives. Before the final act, the children were given a powerful dose of chicha beer. Archaeologists found small ceramic jars next to the bodies, with the residue of corn beer still at the bottom. This was the final dose to ensure they were completely incapacitated, falling into an alcoholic coma, unable to comprehend what was about to happen or resist. For the 7-year-old boy and the 6-year-old girl, death was brutal and swift. Each child, intoxicated, was placed in a pre-dug grave. Then a priest, perhaps using a stone or metal club, delivered a powerful, precise blow to the child's temple. Later, CT scans of the skulls clearly showed fractures from the impact of extreme force. The blow would have caused massive brain hemorrhage, leading to near-instant death or a deep coma from which they would never recover. Their still-warm bodies were carefully arranged in a sitting position, surrounded by funerary objects, and the grave was then covered with dirt and stones. The process was repeated, swift, efficient, and insensitive. But the method used on La Doncella, the 15-year-old girl, was of a different cruelty, a cruelty of indifference. She was also drugged until unconscious, but no blows were administered. Forensic films showed no signs of trauma to her body. Instead, the priests placed the child neatly in a prepared niche, surrounded by figurines and bags of food. They arranged the child's clothes perfectly, making sure the offering looked dignified. Once everything was in place, they sealed the entrance to the niche, probably with a small wall of stacked stones. And then they left. The execution for her was not a blow, but an abandonment. In the absolute darkness, in the thin air and sub-zero temperatures, her body began to shut down. Her core temperature plummeted. Hypothermia set in quickly. The limited oxygen in the enclosed space was depleted. Forensic evidence from her lungs showed that they had struggled to inhale until the very end, an unconscious reflex of a dying body. She died slowly, alone, in the silence of the icy grave. She was not killed by a violent act, but by the environment in which she had been placed. The priests, their mission complete, did not linger. They offered no prayers, no mourning. The transaction was complete. The offering had been delivered to Apu Lulailako. Their work was done. They packed up and began the perilous journey back down, leaving 3 lives behind at the top of the world. The children's bodies tell the story of how they died in chilling detail, but they cannot tell us why. Why would an empire at the height of its power, with its achievements in technology and social organization, resort to such a costly and barbaric process of killing? The answer lies not in the victim's bones, but in the logic of power that powered the Inca state machine. Capacocha was not a crazy act of fanatical faith. It was one of the most effective and sophisticated instruments of governance of the Inca Empire. To understand why such a sophisticated state machine required such a barbaric, murderous process, we must analyze it not as a religious ritual, but as a political strategy. First, it was a tool for maintaining cosmic and social order. The Sapa Inca's primary responsibility was not to rule over humans, but to manage the relationship between humans and the gods. A natural disaster, like an earthquake or drought, was not just an economic problem. It was a political crisis. It showed that the Sapa Inca was failing in his role as a cosmic intermediary, and this weakness could spark rebellion. By initiating the Capacocha ritual, the most expensive and extreme of religious acts, the Sapa Inca made a supreme display of power. He demonstrated his ability to mobilize the empire's most precious assets, children, gold, silver, textiles, and make the ultimate sacrifice to repair the universe. It sent a clear message to all his subjects. The emperor was in control. By quelling the wrath of the gods, he also quelled the seeds of social unrest. Second, and perhaps most importantly, Capacocha was a tool for unifying and controlling the empire. The Inca Empire was a vast multi-ethnic entity, made up of hundreds of conquered tribes and kingdoms. Maintaining control over such a vast and fragile territory required more than just military force. Capacocha dealt with this problem ruthlessly and efficiently. Requiring each province to send its best children to Cusco was an annual test of loyalty. It forced local leaders to submit to the central authority in an absolute way. The sacrifice of one's own son was an unbreakable commitment. Furthermore, the network of sacrificial sites, huaca, across the empire created a spiritual map of Inca power. by placing a sacrificed child, a new guardian deity loyal to the Inca state, on a sacred mountaintop of a recently conquered tribe. The Incas committed an act of spiritual usurpation. They declared, "Even your gods and your mountains are now ours." It replaced local loyalties with a centralized religious system, with Cusco at its center. Third, it was a tool of terror and propaganda. Despite its honor facade, the underlying message of Capacocha was fear. It demonstrated that the state was omnipotent, able to reach out to any family and demand something non-negotiable: the lives of their children. Compliance came not just from faith, but also from fear of an all-powerful power. At the same time, the generous rewards for compliance created a perverse incentive system where subjects competed to demonstrate their loyalty in the most extreme ways. It turned people into active participants in their own oppression. This sophisticated and ruthless machine of power operated for nearly a century, helping to maintain the stability of the empire. But then, the Spanish arrived. Ironically, the very ritual designed to preserve the Inca world order became the main justification the European conquerors used to justify their destruction of that world. For them, Capacocha was devil worship, evidence of barbarism that needed to be eradicated and replaced with a more civilized faith. The legacy of the Inca Empire is a legacy of this terrifying contradiction. On the one hand, there were the brilliant engineers who built Machu Picchu, the administrators who created a highly organized society. On the other, there was a state apparatus that perfected the process of killing children for political purposes. These two things are not contradictory. They are two sides of the same coin. The same organizational sophistication that allowed them to build cities in the clouds also allowed them to operate slaughterhouses on top of the world. The children of Lulailaco are the ultimate testament to this complex legacy. They are not simply victims of an ancient religion. They are the end products of a state machine that has perfected the art of manipulating faith in the service of power.